This is not a test. It's August the 26th, 2007, and my name is Lucinda Sangree, and most people call me Cindy. And we're on the property that used to be known as Northwoods.
Cindy, could you tell us about when you first got involved or heard about the Peace Camp?
Yeah, it was in December of 1982, and I was cross-country skiing in Durand Eastman Park with some women who were a local small chapter of Women Outdoors. And one of them said to me, "You know, there's a bunch of women that are meeting down over the co-op, in the co-op building on Monroe Avenue. They're talking about interesting things, so I think you ought to go check them out." So I went down there on the night that she told me later in the week, and there was the most beautiful woman there talking. It was Sylvia Gassoy, and they were talking about setting up a women's encampment outside the Seneca Army Depot. I really wasn't all that interested at the time. I was doing a lot of, peace stuff already about nuclear disarmament, but the group of women, especially Sylvia, were so interesting that I thought, I'll come back and hear more about this. So I went to several meetings, and then at one meeting they talked about the fact that a woman from Greenham Commons was coming to speak at a church in Rochester, and they were all going to go, so I said, okay, I'll go too, Well, that speech was something. It was about the bases in England and the need for women in America in the United States to support the women in Europe in protesting the deployment of the cruise and Pershing missiles. And after that speech, some of us gathered around the speaker, and we went to a bar in Rochester, a women's bar called Rosie's, and went dancing and talking to the woman from Greenham. And the woman who was hosting this Greenham woman, we said, we all said it was time to go. So she reached to get her coat from where it was hanging near our table. She reached her hand in her pocket, and she said, "My car keys are gone. My keys are missing." So we said, "Wow, that's terrible. Maybe you locked them in the car." So we all went out with her to the car. The car was unlocked, and the keys were on the seat, and the women from Greenham's papers were, her valise was missing. And so we looked around, and finally, down a ways down the street, we found everything except her paper, her personal itinerary, with all the names and addresses of where she was going to go and all that. And so then I thought, somebody was at that meeting, somebody is following this woman, and if it's that important that our government is sending some spy to follow this woman around and take her, her stuff, this is really making a difference. So that's when I got really seriously interested in the peace encampment and decided to help the Rochester women help the encampment. Yeah. After that, I became really good friends with Marcia Craig, and of course I already was a good friend of Chris Eberline, because her mother was a good friend of mine. But Chris and Marcia were key people in the Rochester women's support of the encampment, and Chris was much younger than I am, and Marcia was about my age, just a little bit younger. But Chris was part of the younger bunch, but the three of us, I became really close friends with them, and they had major responsibilities at the regional level. I never, at that point, never did go to the regional meetings, but when Marcia and Chris would come back and say, we're supposed to do such and such, I was very supportive of them. And so Marcia came back one time from one of those meetings and said, well, our job is to find the land. And we said, what? She said, yes, that is the Rochester women's assignment, to find the property that this encampment is going to be on. Whoa, all right. So that got started. Marcia was crucial in that, and some other women came in from New York and other places and helped scout out. And they located a property that was for sale. And I wasn't involved in the regional meetings at that point. I simply would drive with Marcia, who didn't have a car, out, you know, and talk on the phone to Chris and all. And then it came time to loan some money, you know, to the fund that would help tide over till they had the fundraising really going. So I loaned some money, as did other women, and they took care of acquiring this. I hadn't even met Elaine Espenscheid at that point, but who was the lawyer, one of the lawyers. They may have had another one from Albany. I'm not really sure about all the details. And then we heard that there had opened an office in Geneva, I believe. And so I visited that office a few times, but mostly I was helping, you know, give dances in Rochester and put flyers around and sort of talk it up, you know. That's mostly what I was doing at that point. And then one day, Marge and I decided that by then I'd met Marge at a fundraiser for the newspaper in New Women's Times, so that was good. So by then we were very close, and in the early summer, late spring, early summer, we decided we would go see where this was being set up. I guess it was early June. So we called down there. They had a phone by then, and Michelle Crone was directing stuff there, and somebody answered the phone, and we said, we're two women from the Rochester group. We're going to come out there today just to look around. Is there anything you'd like us to bring? And Michelle's voice came back and said, pizza! So we said, what is it? You know, we expected something really, you know, something really, you know, that they could use in their work. Well, so we said, well, if they want pizza they can have. So we went to Geneva and went and got big sheets of pizza and went out there. They were very happy to see us because we had all that pizza. And we sort of looked around, and not at that time there wasn't a whole lot of it was hard to see how this was going to be an encampment, but they were working, trying to mow where the parking lot was going to be, and so we just stayed a few hours, and then we went back, and so then that's how I got involved, and it just became more and more involvement, you know, because these people were doing what I felt and still feel to be very, very important work. And I loved the way they were organizing. They were so knowledgeable. They had a plan for community relations with the townspeople. They were writing this fantastic resource handbook. They had descriptions of nonviolent training that were fabulous, and I thought, yeah, these people know what they're doing, you know. I can join these people, and I can trust that we will really do a good job. And I never had that trust betrayed. No, the nonviolence training, the legal support, the attempt to peacefully address the townspeople, that was so great. Yes, yes. I was a member of 2 affinity groups at different times. The first one was a group that I think we were called the Diggers. Yes, with Andrea and several other people, and I agreed that I wanted to be support for that group, not to be somebody going over the fence, but to be support. And so, of course, I took a nonviolent training with that neat woman whose name I can't remember, from New York City, who liked to teach carpentry and stuff. I can't remember her name, but anyway, she was a marvelous teacher, and I felt that I learned so much about how to get people to talk about what they were afraid of and why in the world they were doing this, and that has helped me years when people ask me to do training, to be sure to cover those kinds of things, because it's not just a technical kind of training that you ought to be taking. You really need to think about what you're doing. And one of the main things I remember about that affinity group was that Andrea suggested that the night before we action, we would have a meeting out in the moonlight and have a ritual. And I thought, this sounds like witch stuff. I'm not sure I ought to be participating in that. I'm a Quaker. And I thought, well, I'll go. And I think it sounds interesting. So I went out there, and we had this lovely ritual in the moonlight about, blessing the land and our action and calling for peace. And it was beautiful. And I thought, this is really what people need to know about. So the next day we went to do the action, and Andrea and others, we dug and put little toys down about peace, and then some people went over the fence. And the nice thing was that there was this incredible organization for support. Everybody had to sign up. The support people had to sign in at the office, and the people who were going to do the civil disobedience had to sign in. You knew exactly where everybody was. You knew who the lawyers were who were going to give support. I mean, it was just beautiful. And so then we, of course, had to follow our people, and we did. We made sure we knew where they were and when they were getting out and all that. And I loved the singing at the fence was great, and it was great. Yeah. And this was after the camp had opened, and after I wasn't there I wasn't there all the time just preceding the opening, but I do remember walking to Ovid to meet the North Carolina people, and then we walked back to the encampment, and that was great. It's about 5 miles from Ovid, and we met them there, and then we walked back with them under their banner. That was great. And the second affinity group I was in was not until the end of the summer, when there was a large national action called by a national group whose name I can't remember at the moment, but it was an umbrella group for large actions in the United States against the deployment of the missiles. And my affinity group was formed in Rochester, and we came down to Waterloo and spent the night in Waterloo Church. And then it was an all-women's affinity group, but the whole action was not all women, but one of the gates was all women, the troop gate. And so we went there, and that was when we decided to dig those of us who were doing civil disobedience decided to dig under the fence because we had a member with a back that really wouldn't take climbing over the fence. So we got our little spades out and we dug, and the Army guys stood there and watched us, and we dug under the fence. And I remember as they put us on the bus, looking back and thinking, gee, I hope they don't try to make this into a felony that we did over $100 of damage just digging under the fence, you know. And then I saw Marcia with her shovel doing something because she was in the support of my affinity group. And I thought, hey, Marcia's filling in the hole so that we won't get a bad charge. And then I saw she was making it bigger so that some more people could get. And I thought, oh man, thank you, Marcia. But that was all right. We, oh great. So then we were held, you know, for a while and then left. And I remember I decided to give my full name, and so and my academic title, because I thought they should know that there were a lot of different people, you know, who were of different teachers and carpenters and all kinds of people from all walks of life who were really doing this, you know. So, and I remember one thing about that summer that I learned was being talked when we were discussing the medium. And I remember, I believe it was Karen Beadle that was talking to us. She is such a sharp person. She really has got a lot of experience, and she was so much younger than I am, and I thought, gee, this kid really knows what she's talking about. Anyway, she said, now, you know, we don't have a spokesperson. Anybody can talk to the press. But just remember, when you're talking to the press, don't try to answer every question they ask you. You say what you want to say, what you need to say, and let them keep asking questions, but you say what you want to say. Otherwise, you'll never get your point across because they will take control of the interview. So I remember that, and I remembered that for years, and it really helps to know how to do that. I think that's probably one of the best pieces of information I picked up in activist work at the Peace Camp.
I had a question, if we can take you back to prior to the camp opening.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense, an image of what it would be or how it would be when it opened?
I did a bit because I worked a lot with Marcia, and Marcia had charge of some of the logistics. And we had a lot of trouble that first summer with getting the permit to open because of the water situation and because of the sanitation and of washing up situation. And so I was there when not to actually be part of, because I was busy doing something else, when they learned, some women suggested, I don't know whether they were women from Northwoods with Shad or who, but they talked about how to dig these trenches and fill them with rocks and to have a for the sinks to wash up. And I remember that there was a real difficulty about the well at the farm there was not anywhere near sufficient for supplying large numbers of women. And I said, large numbers of women? How many are they expecting here? And so I had to leave to go with my family somewhere, and it hadn't been resolved. And by the time I came back, before the opening of the camp, Marcia had arranged for the Rochester women to raise the money to buy a great big water tank and to contract to have water trucked in. And I have a great picture of Marcia that Marge took of her filling that tank for the first time. And it's a wonderful picture of her. And after Marge died, and I wrote her obituary for the Empty Closet newspaper in Rochester, we used that picture with her obituary. And it's a great picture. She's standing there with the big hose from the truck, and she's, you know, we did it kind of look on her face, and Shad is standing there with her hand on her hip watching them fill the tank. You know, it's a great picture, it really is. Yeah. So I remember that was very important, and that's when we discovered, at least many of us did, that the health department of Seneca County was very fair. They didn't give us a hard time, but they didn't give us any slack either. You know, you do it this way and you'll get your permit. You don't do it this way, you don't get your permit. And that was useful for us, yeah. And then I remember also in those early days, a whole bunch of Michigan women came in at some point on their way to Michigan Festival, and did a lot of logistics. They did a lot of building and mowing and stuff, you know. And then I remember that it was hard. There had to be a place where women could meet out when it was raining, when the weather was bad. And I don't know whose idea it was. There were some of these women who were so experienced that I really wasn't in on a lot of those decisions. I was older than some of them, but I was really new to this kind of fantastic energy and outdoor stuff like these. Some of these women who had been to Michigan, who had done all kinds of festival work and all that sort of stuff. But I just marveled at that. But I do remember one of my early days at the encampment. I went out to help on the building this pavilion, which was going to be where we would meet out of the sun of the rain. And I walked up there, and I was standing looking up at some woman up on the roof of that building, and she said, "Hey, hand me that board." I looked around and I was the only person there, and I said, "Me? Yeah, hand me that board." So I said, "Okay." So the only way to get it was to climb the ladder with this board to hand it to her. I thought, all right. So I went up there and handed her that board. That was really wonderful, you know. "Hey, you, hand me that board, woman." It was great, yes. And that was true through a lot of the encampment. People kept saying this over and over again. They were expected to do things, and if they didn't know how, they could learn. So that's what we did. Yes, and it empowered so many women. And then we had to learn how to do security. Even though we might have had nonviolence training, that was a little different than security. And a lot of women told me, and I experienced this too, that it was a good feeling to know that you were out there in the late hours of the night, sitting around, just watching, and if anything went wrong, you had a little walkie-talkie and you could call for somebody to come and help you, and that these women were sleeping safely because we were keeping watch, and that was great. Yeah. So one night I was out there sitting by a little fire in the very back, what was it, Amazon Acres? And that happened to be the night when this guy was streaking through the field, just in his boots. And he just went roaring, you know, just streaking through there. And we all, well, there were several of us yelled at him, "Oh, you ugly guy, get out of here. And he just kept running, went off into the woods. I don't know who it was. He had on army boots, he had big, hiking boots, and he just went streaking across the field. And we said, yeah, what a jerk. I remember that night, yes. That was fun. I also remember, but I wasn't present to see it. I came the next day and somebody told me about it. A bunch of guys invaded the land from the back. Somebody may have already told you about this incident, but the word, and it was in the daytime, and the word went out to the people at the house that there were men coming on the land from the back. And so they said, okay, we'll take care of it. So a whole bunch of women came out to the back field, and as they approached those men, they took off their shirts. And those men turned around and ran. That was it. I said, how did they know to do that? And I said, that's all they had to do, was to take off their shirts and just keep walking toward these guys. How funny, isn't that weird? I also remember meeting in the basement of the Asbury Methodist Church in Rochester with some women from encampment committees. I don't know exactly why they decided to meet in Rochester that particular time, but the idea was to formalize the organization of the work at the encampment. And this was probably, it may have been after the camp had gone from its first summer into '84, and we spread out. One of the women involved had a connection with the Asbury Methodist Church, and so she got the space for us. And we spread out these huge pieces of newsprint on the floor of the education building in the Asbury Church, and we drew the work webs with markers on these papers, and it was copying and further formalizing the webs that had been already drawn up by women at the encampment, because they put these webs up, on the boards on the walls in the house there. But I remember doing it on the floor in the Asbury Church. It was really fun. There's something about working with webs that's very appealing, And I don't know if any of you have read, probably you all have read Louise's book, Nuclear Summer, where she talks about the symbol of the web versus the other symbols that the town was trying to impose on the encampment. A struggle of symbols. Who's gonna set the terms of the language for this summer? The women or some of the very conservative people that came to protest. It was very satisfying to work with women who really understood interconnectedness, and right down to the point of that's how you do your everyday work life, not just in the international politics or whatever, but you take that concept of interconnectedness out of the organic world or whatever, and it's right part of your everyday life. Yeah. Well, in Rochester, we had a group called Rochester Women's Action for Peace, and it was directly related to the support for the encampment at the beginning. And then it began after the summer of '83. It functioned on its own, not directed toward the encampment so much, but directed toward local peace work and national issues, but addressing them locally. And that group became more and more focused on what we did in Rochester. for instance, the Memorial Day Parade, peace contingent in the Memorial Day Parade in Rochester was a direct result of the work of those women who picked up the attempt by a local church to march as a peace group in the Memorial Day Parade, and they were given a really hard time. So the next year these women in Rochester decided, well, we'll address this. So they did, and women from the encampment came up and helped, and it was such an incredible struggle that finally all of the veterans dropped out of the parade that year, except the Vietnam veterans for peace, who stayed in and marched with the women. And every year after that, it's just sort of expected that there will be a peace contingent of some kind in the Memorial Day Parade in Rochester. The next year, the veterans came back, and we tried to reach some kind of a way of working together. We weren't satisfied exactly with the way it went, but they weren't either. So I mean, we both, a person who was really extremely active in that whole thing was Trudy Barron from Rochester, who was in my affinity group when we dug a hole under the fence. In fact, I think it was because of Trudy that we dug a hole rather than climbed over. And so I remember she said that she was negotiating with the veterans of foreign wars who had control of the Memorial Day Parade in Rochester, and they kept calling her, all the women, most of whom were, all of them probably, had been at the peace camp, calling them girls, and so Trudy just stopped the conversation and said, we don't like to be called girls. And they said, well then, what'll we call you? You can, for instance, for me, you can try Dr. Barron. So, oh, all right. So anyway, they did turn their attention that way. And then there was a regional meeting in Albany, and I was asked to go as a representative from Rochester. And I had my feelings, all right, I'll go. Now, what does the group want me to say? Do we want to continue on with this peace encampment after 1983, or do we want to close it and make a decision about what to do? Well, they said, well, you go and tell them we want to keep it open. And I thought, I don't think their heart is in this, but this is what they're telling me I should say. So I went, and that's what I said that the Rochester women wanted, but now I think I regret that I didn't press them further on that, such as to saying, well, what will you do, and what will you do, because they faded after that. And I felt like I'd gotten left with having spoken up in Albany to keep the peace camp going, and where are you guys, behind me. They really weren't. They supported a bit more in '84, but they really were busy at home, and I understand that. We formed the Rochester People's Mime, we did street theater, and all that, and I understood that. But I had gotten so involved with with the workings of the camp and with the town of Romulus that I somehow stayed on. And when we got to that meeting in Albany, I could see that there was a very strong division, and people like Susan Pines from the War Resisters League, and several others said, "This, you mustn't do this, you know, this is not going to work if you keep it going." And I never wanted us to buy, some of them said they didn't want a purchase of land in the first place. And so I listened to that, but then I also listened to the other side, and I remembered a conversation with a Quaker woman that I had had at yearly meeting some years before, when the Vietnam War was on, and she was an elderly woman, and I don't know how we got into this conversation, but we were sitting on a chair outside the building where a yearly meeting was going on, and she described to me a protest that she had been in an earlier war, in World War II, where they took a house across the street from a munitions plant or something, and they stayed there year after year. And I thought, wow, you know. So that also came back to me in this conversation in Albany. And so I didn't take I could go either way, and I had already said, this is my message from Rochester, and then I just waited to see what would happen. Yeah. Feeling that I could go with it either way. But I also felt like once they'd made that decision to keep it open for a while, you know, and Jody Bear was so keen on it, and so were several other people, I thought, all right, I can help do that, you know. I can help do that. But I also remained in the Rochester Women's Action for Peace, but it wasn't really as related to what the camp was doing, although several people were quite helpful, like Claire Parker and Forrest and several other people from Rochester did as individuals come and help. And I think that Marianne Rizzo, I forget when she did that fundraiser, whether it was before the camp closed or, I mean, before the end of '83 or whether it was in '84.
84.
I think it was in '84. So then that was a lot of work, and she raised several $1,000s with that rummage sale, which none of us wanted to do, but she said we're doing it. So, or at least some of us didn't want to do it. I don't like to do rummage sales, but she did it, and it was very successful. Yeah. I was mostly concerned with the water and trying to help with any issues that related to public health. I was helping Marcia, really, and then I went to work. It really changed my life because I decided I was going to do some full-time active work, not just with the peace encampment, but something. So I applied for a position with NYPIRG out in, I think it was in Ohio, and I applied with the Syracuse Peace Council, and I was hired to be the director of the Syracuse Peace Council for a year, and I did that for a year, while I was also working, you know, being supportive to the encampment. Well, and Karen Beadle was around, and Andy Major, and I joined the resistance, what was it called? It was the Nicaragua thing. No, it was that national action against the Contras, where people pledged to enter their congressperson's office and stay there if they were voting to support the Contra. And so the Peace Council, several of us from the Peace Council did that and were arrested in Syracuse in the office of the congressperson there, and I stood trial in Syracuse. It was called the International, it was Call to Resistance or something, and you signed up and then you did it if the Congress was not listening, you know. Yeah. I remember calling, I got out of the arrest pen at the police station, and it just so happened that very night my brother called me from Arkansas and said, "Hi, Cindy, I just called to see how you are." And I said, "I'm fine. I just got out of jail." What? But when I stood trial, I decided not to go on and do a 3-month sentence because I was teaching part-time, and so I didn't do that. But Carolyn Mao and Karen Beadle refused to pay their fine. They were in that affinity group, and they went to jail. Yeah. But the trial was interesting. It was a fair trial. It was not a jury trial, but it was an experience with the court trying to intimidate us, really scare us, This person's with the Peace Council. We should really give her a long sentence. But it was a good experience. Tons of people from Syracuse did this, and we were, and they did in Rochester too. Joe Cummings and Marcia Craig were arrested for the same action in Rochester, and Marcia wrote their brief for their defense in their trial, and it was beautiful. It was a lot smaller, yeah. It was not hugely small. Well, yeah, it was a lot smaller, but I wasn't surprised, but a lot of people were very surprised. I thought, in fact, I was surprised that it was as large as it was, because that excitement, that push, we've got to do something, about specifically the missiles, was over, and the missiles were deployed. And now comes a long-term opposition to nuclear weapons again, just keep plugging away. And I thought, people aren't going to come back. A lot of people won't, but some will, and some did. Yeah. The thing that was interesting was that we did keep a good handle on organizing the civil disobedience. There was training, there were workshops, not just on civil disobedience, but on a lot of women's issues, and there was legal support, and that's when Jane was there that summer, wasn't she? Jane Sluthman, yeah. She and Ann Willard were there. And it was well organized. The food was, again, well organized, and it is just smaller. Yeah. And I think the townspeople were a bit shook that people were still there. And then the next year they were still a bit shaken, I think, but it began to be sort of like, well, this is what they're doing. And everything began to change a bit after '84 in the kind of permanence feeling of the place. Yeah. We're here, we're in your face, and we're trying to help people keep the awareness raised in this area of the country about what's going on at the depot and about the dangerous weapons there. Once I was no longer a director of the Peace Council, I moved back to Rochester. I left because I couldn't support myself on that salary, and I had separated from my husband and was getting a divorce, and I was really beginning to think, I have to think about what I'm going to do financially. So I moved back to Rochester to see if I can get myself back into teaching again. And my role with the Peace Camp, I was in and out. I didn't go there and live. No, I was in and out. And I feel like I could pretty much be called on the telephone if there were problems that people thought I could help with. And I did go out from time to time to visit and to be part of protests, because there were certain protests that took place every year, like Mother's Day and others. And I remember there was a hearing, a traveling hearing by state legislators at one point, and I can't remember what year it was, but it had to do with women and economics, I believe, and jobs and stuff. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember that I wrote a fairly long paper, which I got on the agenda and read, about the relation of the plight of women to military spending and women's poverty and military spending. And I brought in mention of the encampment in that piece. And I wrote a piece for the Empty Closet about my first trip to the peace camp, and about kinship, about building community. It's called Community and Revolution. I wrote a piece for the Empty Closet called Community and Revolution. It was based on Barbara Deming's notion about building the beloved community, and it had to do with kinship ties and the place of lesbians at the peace encampment. Leanne and I at one point were going to write a book about the encampment, and as time went on, I felt I couldn't do that. I didn't have the energy to write a book. So I talked to Leanne about that, and she said, well, if we do go ahead with the book project, will you write a chapter or two? And I said, yeah. And she said, will you write a chapter about the zapping? So I wrote a chapter. And what happened was, Kate called me, a woman from out of town. I'll have to not, some of us still feel threatened by this whole subject, so I'm not going to necessarily use all these names. Right. You know, a woman called me from out of town, and she said, there's going to be a meeting, and I want you to come. And so I said, okay, because this was a person I really cared about. So I went, and the person we met at and saw a film that this other woman had. There were about 6 or 8 of us, I guess, and it was a film it was called Pandora's Box, and it was about the electromagnetic radiation and spy work of the Russians on the American embassy, and how the American government never even told those people that were working in the embassy that they were being subjected to. They had found out about it, but they didn't tell their own embassy people that the Russians were doing this, and to them, and with great drastic, terrible health effects on some of the staff of that embassy. And then the film went on to show laboratory experiments being conducted on animals with these waves of electromagnetic energy. And then after we saw this film, we all sat around in a kind of a stunned silence, and word was coming that people at Greenham were being subjected to this kind of treatment by the military. And maybe it was happening to us at the women who came to Seneca Army Depot, the encampment next to the Seneca Army Depot. So we formed a committee. We called it Committee of Rainbow Light. And we started reading in libraries, looking up stuff. We kept in communication with the Greenham women. We got in communication with a number of scientists, both in this country and other places. And we met regularly, and we compiled a plan. From time to time we changed the plans. What to do? Should we tell women at the encampment that we suspected this? Should we try to measure it? What should we do? So we worked on this for some years. And well, we were convinced that this was happening. It was interesting, some of the attempts, I remember one in particular where we had arranged to get equipment, and at the last minute it fell through. People would back off. People kept backing off. We had plans to contact specific Congress people, and it would go nowhere, you know. And later, it's interesting now when you read about some of the stuff that was going on in later years. There was a report in the Christian Science Monitor about non-fatal weaponry or whatever, and that's one of those things, you know. Pat Schroeder is on that committee, and that's one of the persons we had tried to contact, we had to make a decision at some point. Are we going to keep trying to secretly to measure this stuff and get nowhere, or shall we try to make this as loud a statement as we can to warn people in general about it? And we made the decision to do the second. And packets were put together, and people went to conferences of activists and set up tables and did workshops on the dangers of this. And the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom once took a packet to a UN committee with them when they were talking about something at the UN. And we tried to make it as open, and, you know, you're not going to keep this hidden, you know. If you're doing this kind of stuff and developing these kind of weapons, we're going to try our best to shine a light on it. It became a difficult topic because we wanted to talk to people, but we didn't want to go into detail about who was doing it, because several members on this committee suffered some real physical effects and felt like they had to distance themselves from this, and one or two of them to this day, they don't want to be mentioned, they don't want their names to come up, because how they still feel threatened. If you go and read some of the literature about this kind of weaponry, there are certain things that come up which we now, looking back, can read and say, oh yeah, that happened to me. You know, the sunburn at night, the confused thoughts, the nausea, the anxiety attacks, and that sort of thing happened to people on the land. Yeah, I went to talk with one of the women who'd been very adversely affected and talked to her about it, and she said it will wear off, you know, over some period of time, and it got less on her, but I don't think she ever really totally recovered. And there have been some health effects. Who can say, you know, what might have come onto people anyway in their life as they got older? But there's one person with a lot of muscle weakness. There's me with detached retinas when this has never been a problem in my family. Eyes never, you know, and relatively early cataracts. And then one person who's had a lot of trouble over the years with very confused thoughts. And that person I talked to, and she said it gets better, but it takes time. So just, you know, relax. You'll get better. I know once I went on a bird walk a few years, maybe 88, 89, on the Cape, and the walk was on one of those little pieces of land that's slightly away from the Cape. You had to take a boat to get there, and then you walk across this little island, and you see, you know, birds nesting. You're going to observe birds. Well, when I got off of the boat and I started to walk across the land with the group, I couldn't walk. I literally could not stand up. And Marge had to grab me on one side, and the trip leader had to grab me on the other. And I said, what's going on here? And I said, are we in the path of one of these observation ray, towers that picks and warning system? And he said, oh yeah, it goes right across this island. And I said, well, so they helped me, and I walked out of it. And then I could walk for the rest of the bird trip. And when we came back, I couldn't walk again, and they helped me on the boat. And I said, has anybody else had this happen to them coming on this bird trip? He said, one other person. Actually, it was so bad for him, he couldn't take the trip. He had to get back on the boat and go back to the mainland. And I said, well, where did he come from? What was he doing? Well, he was a professional. He was in the Army, and he set up radar stations for the government. And so I said, okay. So we went back to the mainland when the bird walk was over, and I went and laid down under a tree. I couldn't move, hardly. I was exhausted. I couldn't hardly move the rest of the afternoon. Then I felt better, But I'm very careful, where I live. And I remember there was a little piece of land that was available for sale that I was thinking about buying that was part of this property that Shad hadn't been able to include. So I thought, I was talking to my lawyer, and I said, well, maybe I shouldn't just bother. And she said, what if knowing my history, she said, what if somebody tried to put a cell phone tower up there? I said, okay. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand it. I don't think I could deal with it, having something like that so close by. Yeah.
Was there ever a point in this understanding of this microwaving that you freaked out, like emotionally, that the government could be doing this?
Oh, we thought so all along. There was no point in freaking out.
But the fact that it could happen didn't move you, like intellectually or emotionally, that you lived in a country that the government would
Oh,
do this?
well, I was already freaked out after the visit with the Greenham woman in the bar. I mean, what? They follow this woman, they steal the keys out of the pocket of her hostess, and they open her car and take her private papers out, and then they let her know, that they've done it. I mean, they're trying to scare this woman. And they also wanted the information. And I remember another time on the land when near the end of the encampment days, and I was spending the night there, and a person came whose name I really don't want to tell you. She went around and took a bunch of pictures of the depot, which you weren't supposed to do. She was just clicking, from the outside, not doing anything. And then she spent the night at the encampment, and the next morning she came out, and she said, I think I left my camera in the truck overnight. So she went and she looked in, and there was her camera, opened up, the film taken out, right there, ta-da. So, why freak out? This is the way it is. You just have to choose your path and try to see what you can tolerate to do in terms of being oppressed. For instance, I'm reluctant at this point to do. I would have to think a lot more carefully about doing civil disobedience at this time, and I've told my group of raging grannies that in Rochester, because I think that if I were interned in one of these institutions that has all of this electronic stuff around it, I think I'd probably go blind very soon. And now, what can I do better by doing work outside and keeping relatively healthy, even though there's a lot of that stuff around anyway, or going into an environment where I know ahead of time that they wouldn't even know what risk they were putting me into, you know? They wouldn't deliberately do that, but I know. Oh, well, maybe they would if I were obnoxious enough. Or they might not even care. Even. That's right. That's right.
So if the camp by this point had already dwindled down, in your opinion, why would the military be directing some kind of electromagnetic weaponry at the camp at that point?
Well, it hadn't dwindled that much. We were still having an effect. I mean, when the government said they wanted to make a plutonium storage site at the depot, the encampment, I think, was a major player in helping the town realize what was going to happen there. And
what year was that? When was that?
I can't remember the year, but it was when do you remember? Anybody remember when? It was later years, because I remember we had stored one of the Memorial Day statues or paper mache things in the garage at the encampment, and we pulled it out. It had been there several years, and we pulled it out and we put it on a tree. It was a blue goddess figure, a head of a blue goddess, and we put a sheet to it like a cape and attached it to other trees. And then we painted one of the eyes shut and one of the eyes was open. We put a big sign up that said, "Wake up, plutonium at the depot." And then women went around town and leafleted about this, and I think it was a major player in the town being aware that this was not a good idea. I wrote a long letter about it to the Eco Village people in Ithaca who were building, you know, this nice Eco Village outside of Ithaca. Other people wrote letters, and I think it helped. You know, there were things going on there all those years that were not good, headed in a wrong direction. And I think the presence of the camp, however small, was still a very important consciousness-raising institution. Yeah, that's why I kept working with it. I guess I was scared for my health, not my life, when working with coral. Yeah, I was, especially when I saw what was happening to one particular person. Some of the other ill effects of that showed up later in some of the women, a couple of them. And we don't know now whether they would have shown up anyway. But yeah, I know one woman who absolutely it didn't become a member of Coral, and I know she too. I know who said, "I'm out of here. I'm not going to do this because of this risk." You know, and one of them was rightly so, was afraid because she was thinking she might get pregnant, and that's, you know. But the other one, it was just simply like, I'm not going to subject my head to this, you know. And that was her choice. That's fine. You know, she was extremely sensitive to it. Yeah.
Can I ask what was the outcome of bringing the, you said you created information packets and tried to present them to Schroeder and who else? Was there any response at all on the government level?
I never heard, I had a letter from one of our members who said she never really got an answer from Schroeder. She just said, you know, acknowledged that she got the letter, but she never spoke back to her. And as far as I know one woman saw that guy who wrote the book, Paul Brodeur, The Zapping of America. You know, she saw him at a conference on environmental stuff, you know, somewhere. He said she started to approach him to talk to him. He said, "You women, keep away from me." I mean, he was aware of his tenuous position regarding how much information was out about this stuff. And there are other members of Coral who know more than I know about what went on with some of these contacts, because at some point I had personal affairs to tend to and so on that distanced me somewhat. But I'm sure that you'll have interviews with some of them who know a good bit more than I do about that, because they were more intensely involved in some of these contacts than I was. Yeah, but I do know that at one point an activist in Rochester came up to me and said, "I was just at a meeting down in Florida of activists in general, and there was a table there about this da 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 da. Is that for real?" And I said, "Yeah, it's for real."
And around 89 or so, we started, I think, was Transformer Guy. And I wonder, do you have memories of that?
I do, yes. I remember that I don't know about everybody else, but I remember my feeling was that we were beginning to come into a situation that was unfortunate. And we had some really wonderful women had come there and spent time, the Dyke band, and kept spirits up, and people going into colleges and making presentations to women who were interested in feminism and anti-militarism, and who wanted to know about the history of the encampment and what we did there. There was even a woman who had done a curriculum for a high school in the area, and curriculum materials about peace and the peace encampment. The depot was probably going to be closed. We were pretty sure about that, and that was a good thing. And there were fewer people there, but some people were coming and staying for long periods of time, like months and months, to be there during the winter months, maybe doing some study for women's studies curriculum in a college, or doing some kind of internship for some kind of association they were associated with. But then other things were happening that were not fortunate. The word was out that this was an open women's land. And so some persons began to arrive that really were not there to do peace work or to study feminist process or to take in nonviolence training, and they were not there to try to get a better handle on the connections between patriarchy and women's poverty and military spending and things like that. They were there because they were so ill. There were a few people who showed up from time to time. And I began to become quite concerned about this, because we didn't have the facilities or the people with skills to address the needs of these women. And I felt there was an increasing danger that we could get into a difficult situation for the women and for legal reasons. So I was talking with people about maybe it was time to think of closing things. Conversations like that went on. Well, one night I was at home in Rochester, and I got a call, and it was from a peace camp woman who happened to be on the land all by herself. And she was one of the youngest persons that had come and stayed a long time. And she said a woman had shown up that late afternoon and was there and was threatening suicide. And I said, oh dear. All right, I'm a long way away. I want you to call the sheriff, and I want you to call Pam Flanagan in Geneva. And I want you to tell the sheriff what you've told me, and I want you to get in your car and go to Pam's and spend the night. We're not going to have you there in a dangerous situation like that, and we don't want this woman to hurt herself. So that's what this woman did. And I thought, how many more times is something like this going to happen? This is not a good scene. We've got to make a better plan than this. So a bunch of us started talking, and we even had some meetings about whether we should continue or not. And at one of those meetings, or several of them, Twilight was there. So Twilight one day did a horoscope. She was into doing horoscopes of organizations at that time. So she did a horoscope for the camp. And she came up with this phrase, transform or die. And so people took that seriously. Somebody painted it up on the outside on the board. You did, Hershey. You painted it up. And then the conversations began in earnest. And the question was, transform to what? All right, what? So at one meeting I think it was in '89, the decision was made to form several committees who would, we've put the word out, let's have some proposals. So proposals started coming in like a lot of them. Some were long, and some were very short. And so the meeting was held to pick out several proposals from that bunch. And they were sort of divided into categories. And then they boiled down to either 3 or 4 that seemed to capture everything more or less that what people had said. And so a committee was formed around each one of those proposals. And they were supposed to come back in 1991 with results of their study. And then we would make suggestions to the mailing list, and come back in 1992 and make a decision as to which one of those proposals was going to be accepted. Now that's the chronology that I remember. Somebody else might remember it a little clearer or a little differently. But essentially it had to do with receiving proposals, selecting a few to study, and then a report being brought back, and then a consensus made on one of those. And that's what we did. And the consensus that came out, I can read you the minute if you want me to read it to you. Sage took the minutes, and a decision was made. And here is what Sage sent me. She didn't send the whole minutes of the whole meeting, and she said she'd do that later, but I did receive this from her. Meeting July 4th, 1992. Consensus was reached on the following resolution. Quote, the Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice no longer exists as a political entity. Instead, it will be transformed into a land trust for women of peace. There are 10 founding members who will form a collective which will affiliate under some umbrella trust organization. The founding members include Kat, Anne, Mary, Otter, Marshall, Estelle, Kiara, Sage, Elliot, and Hershey. Okay, so that was the decision, and there followed then a period when those women met and they wrote bylaws, and it was I said I will take on the responsibility that if you just make your bylaws and you get ready, I will assist in any way I can so that we can lay down this corporation of the Women's Peace Encampment and you can have your own incorporated papers, because I didn't want any legal responsibility or any kind of name use to be left for the women's encampment, because I felt that we had an obligation to the wider body of women out there who had all worked on the camp and all done stuff for years, to make it clear that the encampment had ended. And this was no longer the peace encampment. It was no longer an open women's land under the encampment. Whatever the collective decided to do, that was their business. But that was ended, and this was a whole new entity with legal rights to the land, legal rights to the fundraising and whatever, and total responsibility. So I did help in that. I helped them with the lawyer's fee and I have a letter here from Elaine. I think I have Elaine's letter here somewhere, if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. July the 5th, 1955. Legal services rendered. Women's Peace Land Incorporated. Prepared bylaws and amend as adopted at the annual meeting of July 4th, 1945, per discussion with Ann Herman. Services rendered May the 22nd through July 5th, 1995. And it's on the stationery of Elaine S. Scheid, attorney at law. And the balance was given, and it was marked paid. And so that helped clarify the situation. There was not an agreement that was arrived at and agreed to as to what the future of the land would be if the collective had decided to disband or whatever. But that was the best that could be done at that time. And so that's what happened. And the other proposals that were discussed were, one was to sell the land and give the money to peace groups. Another one was to have make a gift to the Cayuga Indians in the area, and then there was this collective proposal, and there may have been one more, and if there was, I don't remember what it was, but we did choose this one. And not hundreds, but a large number of women had written in to express their opinion and all before we had decided on these proposals, which ones to study. Leanne and I had the task as a committee of two to look into the Cayuga land gift. Yeah. And I don't remember who was on the other research committees, but we met on July and made that decision. Yeah.
Can you tell us what you and Leanne came up with in your research?
Well, we found that there were two branches of Cayuga Indians, one in Canada and one in the United States, and we walked the land with a woman, a Native American woman, and she made it clear that if we had a commitment to this or that for the future of the land, such as environmental this or environmental that we should not expect to tie the hands of whoever received this gift. And they might come and build a great big filling station there, or we shouldn't go into this with any idea that we were going to be the boss forever. And that was important for the women to hear that, And it wouldn't be women only. And furthermore, if there got to be a fight, a disagreement between factions of Native Americans over this piece of property, that maybe it would be our fault. We shouldn't have gotten into this in the first place, or maybe we shouldn't feel guilty if there was a dispute. But anyway, when we laid out this whole report, the women there decided that maybe this was not the best route to take, that we didn't really know what we were getting into if we tried to go that route. So it was better to look, and so we looked at the others as well, other proposals. And before this had happened, before the transformer die situation had happened, in some earlier years, I had become concerned about all the papers and the pictures and all the archival stuff that was just sitting around. And I thought, what a lot of interesting history here that shouldn't be lost. So I asked, and people were glad to preserve it, but how? So I went to the lesbian archives in New York, lesbian herstory plays in New York, and archives in New York City, and I didn't actually go there. I talked to them on the telephone, and their advice was to pick a place as close to the encampment as possible, maybe Albany's Women's Studies, and to be sure that I had a contract that involved not hiding the lesbian involvement, to make sure that the word lesbian would appear wherever it was, really there, appropriate, and to make sure that the collection was accessible to women walking in off the street. They didn't have to have a bunch of plastic cards to get into the library, and that those things were important. And they didn't feel that their library was the most important, was the most appropriate place to put this collection, because they said they were afraid that it was for all women, and they were afraid that straight women just wouldn't come ever and use. At that time, nowadays that might not be such a concern, but at that time that was a definite concern. So they suggested. Oh, and the other thing that we were supposed to put in the contract was that people could use the archives before it was cataloged, because what happened to some women's materials in some libraries was that it would be just constantly shoved to the bottom of the agenda, and women couldn't access material about women. So they suggested that the library at Radcliffe College in Boston, in Cambridge, was really, in their opinion, the best place to go. So that's where I started having conversations with them. And I told them that they had been recommended by the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And they were very receptive. And so we worked to draw up a contract. Me and I don't remember who else working with me. Certainly I went to the women living then on the land and showed them the contract. And we had to work out things about protecting the privacy of the women. And I didn't write that section, but I received that from women who were living on the land at that time, that how to protect the privacy of women. It had to be, the collections at Radcliffe, at the Schlesinger Library, are open to everybody, men and women. And that was okay with the women, but having the names and the pictures identified, the contract's pretty strict about that, and so that was written in. So once the contract was accepted, then I fundraised in Rochester to get money to, and once a meeting on the land had agreed that it was okay to start taking them there, that the contract was okay, and it was to start taking them there was okay. Then I raised money in Rochester to rent a truck, a small van, and went to the encampment with my dog Bill, and we loaded up the van, and I made 2 trips, once with just Bill, I believe, and a woman from the encampment who needed a ride to Boston. And then the second trip, there wasn't any woman who needed a ride to Boston, so I called Nat, who was then Nat Harrison, and now her name is Michaels. She's gone back to, I think it's her family name, and asked her if she wanted to go with me. And she said, sure. So I picked her up in Albany. She took the train down to Albany, and I picked her up, and then we drove the rest of the way. And we stayed with Mike Johnson that time. That was fun, lots of fun, yeah. And then we came back, and I let her off at Albany, and she went back to her cabin. And up in Vermont. So that's what happened. And the instructions for the archives with the Schlesinger, they said there'll be things here that, you know, will be duplicates or that we won't want. It won't be appropriate because maybe we can't date them or we can't read them or for whatever reason. What do we do with what we want? And I said, well, I can't tell you what to do because nobody said. So you better not throw them away. You better box them up and send them back. And they said they would. So that was before Transformer Die, and then after Transformer Die, after that meeting and the decision was made, and after the bylaws were done, I really haven't had a lot of contact with the women of Peaceland.
But Cindy, you were part of the Black Committee when they were closing down the...
Oh, that's right. That's true.
Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah, that is true. That has more to do with the relationship with the depot in a sense, doesn't it? Well, yeah, the Army, the decision did come down in '92 that the Army base was going to close. The government was shutting it down. And so they were just going to kind of walk away. And luckily, I don't know how much hand the women had in this, but certainly the local people around the depot said, wait a minute, there's some legal problems here. And they got their congressman on this to tell them that they had to follow, you know, the regular base realignment and closing law and do it according to a certain procedure. And that procedure involved, among other things, appointing a committee from local citizens to be an advisory committee and to hear the plans for cleanup of, and meanwhile the base had been designated a Superfund site for toxic waste, for toxic pollution. Not much was said about the radiation pollution, but all these big burning fields where they exploded, you know, and munitions and stuff. And so there had to be a cleanup. And what was the Army going to be responsible for? So 3 of us decided, who had been in the encampment, we decided to volunteer as citizens. And even though I lived in Rochester and my legal address wasn't there, they said that was okay. And so I and Ann Herman and Estelle joined the Base Realignment and Closure Committee. And for 4 years we went to those meetings on the base. It was fascinating. It really was. And we heard them give presentations about, you know, PowerPoint presentations about cleanup and this. And Ann Herman had a lot of knowledge about chemistry and stuff that far surpassed anything I knew. And she would ask the most intelligent and knowledgeable questions. They got to where they really respected her. And Estelle knew an awful lot about the way things had happened over the years at the depot, shipments coming and going, you know, and where things were said to be stored in what different areas, which corner was this and that and so on, because women had done some reconnaissance in there, shall we say. And so we 3 went quite faithfully to those meetings, and I'll tell you that I think that there was a lot of listening to us. I think we were under surveillance a lot whenever we were on the land. I know I went there one time when neither you nor Ann happened to be on the land, and I slept in the driveway with my dog in my truck. And I don't know why I did that. Maybe Bill was nervous or something, my dog. Why did I sleep out in the van, my truck? But boy, I was not well the next morning, I'll tell you. And what? So I think that the house was receiving something. Maybe it was the Coast Guard thing. So maybe it wasn't surveillance, but boy, I wasn't well that day. But anyway, we did serve on that committee and help them realize that there was something more to this closing of the depot than just what would it do economically for jobs and this and that, but there was a real responsibility of the Army to look at this, you know, what a mess. One thing I learned serving on that committee that I hadn't known was that the Army was only responsible for cleanup to the point of the expected use of that piece of property in the future, which meant that there was a constant tug by the Army to keep the land, the use of that land as kind of non-pure as possible. If you were going to use something for residents or for people, you had to clean to a much higher level than if you were going to store something out there or, you know, do. And they wound up having to make a lot of compromises, I think, with what would have been maybe the best, because now where they had the Army firing range, they now have a police training academy. So instead of cleaning up the lead there's more lead than ever. I don't know what they're going to do about the Q corner. I don't know what they've done about it yet. They offered the middle part where all those ammunition bunkers are, that they just took the doors off of and made them empty and then left. All those little humpy things, you know. They offered that whole area to the Department of Environmental Conservation at the state level to make a park out of, so to speak. And they turned it down. So that's when they started saying, well, it'll be a tourist attraction for the white deer and all. But we were concerned about the water. There was a plume that went out to Smith Road, and that was the first thing that the Army decided to clean up. And you know, they dug a whole bunch of dirt out and they burned it and supposedly burned off some of the organic solvents, and they trucked out contaminated dirt and all. But then what was left from the cleanup at a site, they would truck it off and put it somewhere else, you know. But all of this conversation was very, I think, it was instructive for us, but it was also instructive for these people from the town who were listening, and we weren't at all afraid to ask questions. I think we pretty much carefully spoke up from time to time. I remember when we raised the question about the fact that the Seneca Meadows was not illegal, it would not be allowed to dump there if that landfill were being built at that point in time, because it didn't have a double liner. So the Army had to face the fact that, well, all right, we're going to plan to put stuff in a landfill that actually shouldn't even be in use anymore.
Was there explicit discussion of what the weapons were at the time?
Yes, and they wouldn't tell us.
Yeah.
No,
so
they wouldn't.
Neither confirm nor deny.
They would not. And furthermore, when we talked about cleanup, they would talk about all these other areas, and then they would get to the Q corner and they would say, well, you know, there's some question about radiation here, but we can't talk about that right now. Right now. And right now never ended as long as I was on the committee, and that was 4 years. Yeah. At one point in the middle 80s, two men from the Natural Resources Defense Council put out a study called Global Armaments, and it was considered by all the reviewers and by science people in the country to be the definitive, at that time, the definitive word on the storage of weapons, including nuclear weapons, around the world. And the Seneca Army Depot was declared to be a storage transshipment site for nuclear weapons. And at that time, the Army quit talking very much about, you know, they didn't answer the question, but they got much more like, well, we don't, you know, what we refuse to confirm or whatever. But it was accepted that that really was the word, and the townspeople quit saying that they weren't there, or some of them who had resisted that idea. There were many who already thought they were there, but everybody all across the state, you know, accepted the fact that those weapons were there, because that was the definitive study that was reviewed in the New York Times. I mean, it was everywhere. It's a great big book, and we were very glad to have it at last. Also, according to Anne Herman, she had to leave at some point and wasn't able to attend very many meetings, but she had conversations with us. She was down in Binghamton a lot, and she said, be sure to ask them, this was after the Gulf War, she said, be sure to ask them about depleted uranium contamination at the depot. Just keep asking them, because you can get contamination, and I understand it from storage of weapons that use depleted uranium. And so that we never got a good answer to that when we brought it up. I got a call from Mary Hilton, who said that they were having financial troubles again and needed some assistance. I don't remember exactly whether I told Mary at that time or whether I just decided that I would call Shad and see if she had received a call, and she had. And I just decided that I couldn't, there was nothing that I really was willing and able to do about it. And I actually thought, well, then this is going to be, I need to find out more about what the legality of all this is. So I talked again, I think it was, to Mary, and I found out that the taxes were 3 years in arrears. And then it became a bigger problem, you know. So then I called the tax office, and I found out what the law was, that you had 3 years, and that's when they could close on, the county could close on it. So what I was hearing from Mary was really the way it was. Then later I heard, I don't remember from whom, that the land had been sold on auction. I was sorry that the women hadn't decided to sell the land before it got so desperate, and then give the money to peace groups, because that was one of the other proposals, and I thought it was one of the viable proposals. So I was sorry about that. Or that they hadn't divided the land, say, and sold 10 acres, which they could have easily done in that locality, I believe, and paid the taxes with that money, but then it might have just happened over again. I was sad that there hadn't been, I know that they had gotten a 501(c), which received tax deductible donations, but I also felt that it was too bad there hadn't been a program that people could see what they were investing in. I thought the mission statement was excellent, but there was no evidence ever, to me anyway, that that mission had enough people involved on site to make that vision become a reality. And so how can you, and I knew I was not going to go join the collective. That wasn't where my energy could be directed at this time in my life. And so that's the way it was, and that's what happened. Yeah. And I felt, the one thing that I still wonder about is Jane Schliessman's ashes. I don't know, that possibly could be addressed by people in the collective deciding to ask permission to go on the land, and I know exactly where they are, and probably several other women do too, right under that walnut tree, and just symbolically remove those ashes and place them somewhere. Somewhere that's sacred to women or honored by women, so that whatever else happens on that land, symbolically Jane Schliessman's ashes will be moved. That would be nice. I would very much like to see that. And let's see, the other thing is that Shad called me again. We talked. She didn't call me again. Again we talked, and this time I believe she called me. I'm not sure, but I think she did. And she said, you know, Jody Bear and I were on the land a few years ago, and Jody, I went to the back of the land, and nobody was there, but I went to the back of the land, and Jody went up in the attic, and she saw a whole bunch of papers in a file that really shouldn't be left there, and I'm afraid that they're left there, that maybe they just left them. And so I called down there. She said, somebody's got to do something. So I said I would call Arrow, but I never could get Arrow on the phone. So I called the county office, the county clerk there, and said, how could one get permission to go, can you get permission to go take something that's been just left there? And he said, somebody's already done that. Somebody's taken care of it. A woman has come, I think, from Waterloo with a truck and has loaded it all up with stuff and taken it away. And I said, it's gotta be Mary. So I called Mary, and she said yes, she had taken it away, and she had it. And I said, great, that's great, it's all taken care of. So then I just left. That was fine, because I said, I called Shad, and I didn't get her, but I left a message on her tape, I think it was, said, don't worry, Mary's got them. She went, she took it all away. And so the collective still has all those papers. Whatever they are, I don't know what they are, but whatever they are, she's got them. So that was the way it was at that point.
I'm going to pause right there.
How to talk to the media as an activist. How to do really what I hope are good workshops on nonviolence when I was asked in the past. I haven't done much of it lately, but I certainly did a good bit for a few years. I learned a heck of a lot more than I already knew about feminist process, which was a good thing. And I learned a real respect for women's spirituality, Wiccan and ritual, that I don't think I ever would have gotten any other way, because I was deep into, and I still am, the Quaker stuff and the traditional. Quakerism is not all that traditional in some sense, but it really is also, it doesn't have a lot of connection into formalized theological thinking other than the Judeo-Christian one. And this, it really expanded my worldview of spirituality as in contact with some of these women at the peace camp. Yeah. And that was good. It was good for me and good for me as a Quaker, not just as a woman, but yeah, I find it enlarges my appreciation of the mystic side of Quakerism, and that's been good. I hadn't ever realized before I went to the peace encampment how constricted women are when men are around. I really had never really consciously been aware of that. And I had not been aware of how troubled men are when women get independence. And I remember that comment by what's that woman's name who wrote a chapter in that book on reweaving the web, you know, that feminine, yeah, she edited it, but one of the writers in that who I think she was quoting somebody else, but anyway, the phrase was lesbians are to the women's movement as Marxist is to the labor movement. And I thought that phrase just went straight to my heart. I thought, whoa, isn't that, because this was already as I was coming out as a lesbian, and I thought, yeah, that's what it's partly all about, you know. And so that being around a whole lot of women in a space where we talk to each other and really try to listen to each other. Then when I was back in the other world, I could notice for the first time, really consciously anyway, in my life, what was going on here. Whenever, and if I taught a class in, you know, and it would be a women's, or if I was running a group somewhere and it was all women and then a man came in, whoa, what happened to these women? That all of a sudden, you know, things are different. I began to notice things that are really important for women to take note of. If they want to, they don't have to retreat necessarily and just live only with, or be only with women, but when they're in the world, if they need to pay attention to the patriarchal, and I begin to use that word, patriarchal, with ease instead of embarrassment, you know. And it really was terrible, very important to me, yeah.
And so is the peace encampment a part of your coming out process?
Yeah, I think so. I think that gave me the courage to suddenly begin to take notice of what I was trying to do in my private life already, but hadn't really recognized what was going on. Yeah.
What about specifically, what role do you feel like lesbians play there?
Oh, tremendously. That's what that article that I wrote in The Empty Closet was really all about, community and revolution. And, you know, what's her name? Shalamus Firestone, who wrote that book, Amazon something. The comment is made, I think, by her in that book, that lesbians are on the edge of women's rights because they are emotionally and financially independent, or they try to be emotionally and financially independent from men. And it doesn't matter whether they are politically active or whatever, just their existence is a revolution. And that spirit was brought to the peace camp by the lesbians. So, and they lived it, and it was important because we were standing against the most explicit force of patriarchy, that is the army, the use of violence in an institutionalized manner to control other, to control society or the world, so to speak. And the other thing that lesbians brought to the peace camp was a network of kinship through lovers and ex-lovers. This notion of kinship unit was brought to the peace camp by all these lesbians, many who had ex-lovers there, or they met people that they got involved with while they were there, and there's a sort of an unwritten, not quite unspoken norm that if there's a breakup, you've got to do your best to do it friendly, to build bridges, and that tie is never broken. And so there was this cross-cutting net of social relationships that helped hold the peace camp together that summer, and it went on over into the next years as well. It was not the reason why my marriage broke up, but it became the focal time for that to happen, and that was difficult. And my ex-husband and I are still, we worked it out. We're good friends, and he's remarried. He's very much happier than he ever would have been growing old with me. But that was hard. But it happened at that time because that's when I met a whole bunch of really strong lesbians, and I was already headed in that direction, but I didn't know how to deal with it. Yeah, but that was very important. Yeah, and I think I've met a number of other women who speak in a similar vein. They didn't necessarily come out as lesbians, but they changed their whole social relationship in their private lives, changed, even if they didn't recognize themselves as lesbian. There was some big changes in their lives, It's not the way it used to be, buddy, Well, racism is really deep in this society. And I don't think we did very much about it, addressing it. I don't think we did. I think there were women there who would have liked to. But I don't, that was my experience. And other people will have had, especially people who lived there for a longer period of time, probably had other experience of the camp along those lines, but that was my experience. Yeah, for one thing, our location was difficult for women of color, really difficult, and that says something about our society, doesn't it? That there's not African American women said they weren't comfortable in that environment, out in the country, isolated. At least one person said that. It's scary, It's too bad. But I do remember that when I went to the international lesbian conference in Atlanta, I think it was in 91? I think so. I was impressed by the organization of that conference, where an incredible amount of energy went into making explicit the involvement of women of color, women with disabilities, women of size, older women, and workshops addressing various issues. And it was a good lesson to me to note, well, when they made an effort and involved women with disabilities in the planning. Look how many wheelchairs are at this conference. Oh, wow. I thought, well, you know, that's the way it goes, I guess. Yeah, and some efforts were made at the encampment. The ramp out to the pavilion. I think Adrian Rich sent the money for that, I was told. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what I was told.
Is there anything we didn't ask? Anything you want to say? Go down in Herstory?
Go down. Oh, I just think it's exciting you guys are doing this. I really do. Yeah. I'm really glad. I'm glad that I didn't try to write a book. I think this is the media to put this out of. This is campy. This is the camp. I mean, it's like the way we work, you know. Well, because it's not like two people sitting down and writing a book. It's people getting involved, and it's got the media of the youth here. I mean, all this techie stuff, you know. I think it's great.
And